The story of Easter Island has always fascinated me, not just because of the huge enigmatic statues, but because Easter Island was, before European contact, a miniature analog to the Earth. It was a little world, isolated in the Pacific, colonized by human beings only about 1,000 years ago. And within a 500-year period, there was a population explosion, environmental destruction, and population collapse. I will retell that story very briefly, and then I will discuss some of its implications for human nature. Now, I have talked about Easter Island before, but it's worth talking about more than once, because it is such a good analogy to the world as a whole, especially in the modern era. So here's a very brief retelling of the Easter Island story. The original Polynesian colonists found a paradise of abundant food. They brought no diseases with them. So for many generations, they lived lives free of disease, hunger, and war. At first, they could easily kill dolphins and seabirds for food, so they did. The island was covered in a lush forest of huge trees, which could be cut down for canoes or lumber, and also for firewood. Eventually, the dolphins and seabirds disappeared, so the Easter Islanders switched to agriculture as their main source of food. As their population grew, they spread over the island and formed different clans on different parts of the island. These clans seem to have lived together in peace, as they traded resources and probably mates. The human population continued to grow. Eventually, it reached a peak of about 15,000 people, possibly more, all descended from probably fewer than a dozen original colonists. At some point, close to the peak of their population, the Easter Islanders decided to build giant stone statues. No one knows why. Polynesians have a cultural tradition of building statues and totem poles, not that different from the totem poles of the northwest coast of Canada and the United States, which is interesting, but I'll just leave that there. But they didn't have a tradition of building statues quite like those on Easter Island. Not on that scale, and not in that peculiar, monotonous style. The Easter Island statues were all basically the same. They were heads with rough bodies. The body was basically just a cylinder. The head was large. It had a fairly stylized face with large eyes. And apparently the statues, when they were erected, were wearing hats. But those that you have seen, the iconic image of the Easter Island statue, is missing the hat. So they built these giant statues with hats. And nobody really knows why. And this happened around the peak of their population. And then during the height of their statue building mania, they descended into war and cannibalism. And by the time that happened, the island had already been deforested. The trees were gone. They had cut down all the trees. They cut them down to build canoes, and they cut them down for lumber and to clear the land for agriculture. They were intensively farming pretty much all the land that could be farmed. They grew taro root, which is a tricky thing to grow because I think it requires an irrigated field. So they had to, I think, terrace some of the landscape to create taro fields. And they probably grew some other things, like maybe some tree crops. And they had chickens. But Easter Island was never that good for agriculture, especially the kind of agriculture that Polynesians practiced, using tropical plants. Because Easter Island was a little bit too far to the south. It was a little bit too cold and a little bit too dry. Anyway, at the time of their peak population, the island had been deforested and the landscape had eroded, and much of the soil had washed into the sea. Now, Easter Island, like most Pacific islands, is volcanic, and so it had rich soil initially, and it had a lush forest. But today it is a grassy island with very few trees, and it's highly eroded. So at this time, at the peak of their population had been growing for a long time. And unlike a modern Western population, where the average age is quite old, on Easter Island, the average age would have been quite young. Each generation would have been roughly twice the size of the previous. The population would have been doubling roughly every 30 or so years. And so, in the final generation before collapse, there were a lot of kids. And those kids were growing up. And as kids grow up, they eat more food. Those of you who have teenage children will know what I mean. They eat a lot of food. And so, as these kids were growing up, food was becoming scarce. And this was happening probably for the first time in their history on the island. That not only were they running out of food, but they had no feasible means of expanding their food production. And certainly there was nothing they could do in a single generation. There was nothing they could do in a few years. And that was all the time they had to expand their food production before the kids grew up. Right? So they were facing starvation. If anything, the food production was contracting because of the degradation of the environment. And so they couldn't switch to a new source of food because there was nothing that they could conceivably eat. They couldn't go back to the sea and try to extract resources from the sea because at this point they had no canoes. They had no trees to build canoes from. And Easter Island isn't a great place for fishing, at least with the kind of technology that the Polynesians had anyway. Even if they had trees, they couldn't have extracted very much food from the sea. So there was really nothing to do except fight over the remaining resources. The land on which to grow food. And also to kill and eat one another. And so that's what they did. Genocidal and cannibalistic warfare literally consumed the Easter Islanders until their population fell to about 2,000 or so survivors. And they lived on in desperate poverty and endemic warfare for probably about 100 years or so until the first Europeans discovered the island. And then things got even worse for the survivors. But that's another story. There are very few descendants of the Easter Islanders. I mean, maybe a few people carry genes from that population, but not very many. Anyway, back to the collapse. During the collapse, the Easter Islanders pushed over all the statues, and that's how they were discovered. Not standing up, staring out to sea, but lying on the ground, and often broken into pieces. They were erected on stone platforms, and it seems that they were deliberately pushed off the platforms, sometimes onto rocks, that were moved into position so that the statues would break. So they had some animosity toward the statues, for reasons that are not entirely clear, but can be guessed at. Alright, well, there are a number of lessons that we can learn from the natural experiment of Easter Island. The one that I have talked about before is simply that human beings are not magic. We are part of nature. We are selfish life forms, selected to reproduce, and the human population is normally limited by premature death, just like every other species. In an environment with abundant resources and no disease, like the early days on Easter Island, the human population explodes until resources are scarce and people are starving. Then war limits the population. That's the normal course of events. Something like that happened in the Americas on a continental scale, or actually on a hemispheric scale. The Americas were populated sometime around 15,000 years ago. The population exploded. They ate up most of the animals, and then they lived on forever after in a state of endemic warfare. Because that's just what people do. That's what we evolved to do. We evolved to reproduce. We didn't evolve to live in peace and harmony. And Easter Island demonstrates that very clearly. It demonstrates the reality of human nature. Now, this conclusion goes against what a lot of people believe. A lot of people believe, not based on evidence, but because they want to believe it, that human nature is intrinsically nice. And so bad things, such as war, must have some special explanation, something that lies outside human nature, something extrinsic to human nature. Well, Easter Island is one of the best natural experiments that debunks the humans are intrinsically nice theory. The experiment played out in an isolated environment that was a paradise of abundant resources at the beginning. Left to its own devices, in an isolated but rich environment, human nature generated a tragedy of the commons, which is predicted by the selfish reproducer theory of human nature. And the world today is going through a population explosion that is very similar to what happened on Easter Island. In fact, it's playing out on a similar timescale, and that population explosion is due to modern civilization. On Easter Island, it was due to a small number of people discovering a new environment with abundant resources, and their population exploded until resources were scarce. Well, something similar is happening on the world today due to modern civilization, which has created abundance around the world. And it's very likely that the modern population explosion will end in a way that is very similar to what happened on Easter Island. Global catastrophic collapse. But I have made that point before, so I'm not going to go on and on about it. I think it's worth making more than once, but I'll just leave it there. In this video, I want to talk about another aspect of Easter Island, which is its racial, ethnic, and cultural homogeneity. It is hard to imagine a more genetically and culturally homogeneous population than the Easter Islanders. They descended from probably around 10 or so people who were probably closely related anyway. And so the Easter Island population would have been super duper pure. The genetic similarity between Easter Islanders would have been something like 99.9%. Very, very high. They would have been much more genetically similar to one another than, say, two random white people, or two random Italians, or two random Icelanders. They would have been almost genetically identical. And they had the same cultural traditions. They brought a culture with them, and that culture developed in a small space over 500 years, so they didn't have any conflicting cultural traditions, at least to begin with. And they were so genetically similar, they could have been all brothers and sisters. Probably closer than most brothers and sisters in modern Western families. And yet, they divided into factions that fought, killed, and ate one another. So, take a moment to imagine that. Imagine a parent killing a child from another family, and then feeding that child to his own hungry children. And when he killed that child, he would have been killing a child that was almost genetically identical to his own children. A child who looked probably almost exactly like his own children. We know that sort of thing happened because there is plenty of evidence of warfare and cannibalism in the archaeological record of the island. So the story I'm telling you is based on archaeological evidence, and it's based on cultural evidence from the islanders themselves, the stories they told about their past. So we have a pretty good idea of what happened on Easter Island. It was a catastrophic collapse in which they descended into warfare and cannibalism. Now, this is not a freak occurrence. Warfare and cannibalism are normal human behaviors in times of scarcity. And for most of human history, most warfare took place between people who were closely genetically related, because most fighting was between nearby villages or nearby tribes. It wasn't between people who were separated by vast distances, either geographically or genetically. So for all of human history, people who are almost genetically identical have killed one another, and not just in noble conflicts between adult males, as primitive warfare is sometimes portrayed. They killed one another's children. Warfare has usually involved the slaughter of children and old people and pretty much everybody except young women, young girls. In fact, modern wars are not an exception to that. During World War II, the Allies, the good guys, our team, deliberately killed millions of civilians, many of them women and children. When you're firebombing Tokyo, you know what you're doing. You know that you're slaughtering children. That's what our team did in World War II. Our side deliberately slaughtered women and children. And so it's odd that we should be surprised that this sort of thing has been going on for all of human history. But maybe it's not so surprising. As I'll get to, we tend to lie to ourselves about our role in war. Now, the reason why we are so violent is that we are selfish, and life is a competition. Human beings are not altruistic, even toward others who are very genetically similar. That's not what we evolved to do. We didn't evolve to be nice. We evolved to reproduce. The form of the human body, which includes the human brain, and the human brain generates behavior, right? So the form of the human brain determines things like emotions, empathy, and just, behavior in general. Well, that form has been selected to reproduce, not to be altruistic, because the people who reproduced left behind more copies of their genes that determined the form of the brains of the next generation. So that's how evolution works. We have been selected to reproduce. And that's why we love our children, but are fairly indifferent to most other people, or openly hostile toward them. And whether we're cooperative or competitive with others depends on the benefits of cooperation versus competition. On Easter Island, when there was only enough food to feed maybe 10,000 people, and the population was 15,000, although a lot of them were young, so they weren't eating their full adult amount of food, but they were getting there. At that point, there was no way they could all cooperate, because a large number of them had to die. There was just no other way, right? There was no way they could cooperate and all survive. So cooperation broke down at that point, right? As it usually does. Because human nature is violent, selfish, and selected to reproduce, like every other kind of life. And our delusions of altruism are just that, delusions. Now, I know I keep making this point over and over, but it's really important to hammer this point home, because those delusions are very strong, and that's what makes it hard for people to face the truth about human nature. And it's not just people on the left, it's not just the humanists, it's also people on the alt-right. Many people in alt-right circles believe that racial or ethnic homogeneity is a panacea for social problems. They believe that genetic altruism is the basis of society, and so a racially and ethnically homogeneous society should work really well, while a racially and ethnically mixed society should fail. They believe that people who are genetically similar will be nice to one another and will naturally work together to advance their shared genetic interests. I call this view ethno-altruism. The contrasting view that is popular is humanism. That's the ideological counterpart to ethno-altruism. The humanist view is that we are all basically the same, beneath the skin. There are superficial differences, but we're all human beings. And they like to say this, we are all human. It's a kind of mantra. It's like a religious, it's almost like a religious prayer, It's an article of faith. Humanists believe that war is due to ignorance and prejudice, to racism, xenophobia, religious intolerance, etc. And so, if we could just grow or evolve beyond these primitive superstitions and prejudices, then we could all live in peace and prosperity. That's what humanists believe. I consider humanism to be the religion of the modern West. It has taken over from Christianity, but it has its roots in Christianity. And so it can accommodate Christianity underneath its umbrella. As long as Christians profess the core values of humanism, they will be accepted as ignorant cousins, but still part of the family. Of course, apostates, people of the West, of Christian heritage, who reject humanism, are considered to be evil. And that's how most ideologies work. They reserve special hatred for apostates. Anyway, in the humanist worldview, people are naturally altruistic and rational. Society is based on altruism, and war is due to causes external to human nature. And of course it must be, because war is not altruistic, or it is not rational. And humanists tend to view war as being a kind of selfish thing, but also an irrational impulse. It's driven by irrationality, by things like xenophobia, an irrational fear of outsiders, or religious intolerance, believing in sky fairies that tell you to kill other people, or prejudice that's based on appearances. So these are all irrational impulses. And they think that war is due to these irrational impulses, rather than it being a natural expression of human nature. And so humanists believe things like, if we just stop hating, if we can just overcome hate, then we can end war. And how do you overcome hate? Well, you overcome bigotry and prejudice and all these things. In essence, they think if you overcome ideology, the us versus them dichotomy, and the good versus evil dichotomy, right? If you don't place people on the other side of that boundary, then you can eliminate war. And the problem with this idea is that it doesn't solve the fundamental problem that biology creates, which is competition over resources. That is a fundamental problem that is built into the nature of life, and it cannot be overcome by simply abandoning ideologies. And humanists also aren't aware that their own belief system is itself an ideology, and that they use it themselves to place people on the other side of an us versus them boundary, and to direct hatred at others, and also to compete in zero-sum games for political power and social status. So humanists are wrong and hypocritical. But the ethno-nationalists or ethno-altruists are also wrong in thinking that we can solve the problems that we face simply by defining the in-group more exclusively, by excluding others from the in-group, by defining a narrower group and then being altruistic within that group. See, both humanists and ethno-altruists are altruists. Both of them believe that society is based on altruism. And society is not based on altruism. Society is based on cooperation. And that cooperation takes place in a larger context that is always competitive. So on Easter Island, the Easter Islanders might not have been very competitive with one another initially because they could expand. So instead of competing with other human beings, they were competing with other animals, or even with plants and entire ecosystems. They were changing the environment. And as long as they were able to do that without coming into conflict with one another, they could be relatively nonviolent with one another. They didn't have to have war. But as soon as they reached the limits of their environment, war was inevitable, because something had to reduce the population. And the only way for your children to live was for somebody else's children to die. and in most cases for you to kill somebody else's children or just somebody else on the island and use them as a food source. So humanism can't solve that problem, right? It can't solve the fundamental problem of biology, which is that life is a competition. Just believing that we should all love each other, holding hands, singing songs, professing altruism, does not make it a reality, and it doesn't deal with that problem. But neither does ethno-altruism. It doesn't deal with that problem either. And Easter Island, because it was so isolated and so genetically pure, is a great example of how racial and ethnic homogeneity does not generate a paradise and does not solve tragedies of the commons and is not sufficient to create a coherent and stable society. Just having everyone be genetically very similar does not prevent them from going to war. If there is a conflict of interest that cannot be resolved by other means, right? And some conflicts of interest simply cannot be solved by other means. Now, there is only one way to solve the tragedy of the commons that is built into the nature of life, and that is for us to limit our reproduction, and to do that socially, to socially impose limits on ourselves before the environment does it for us, before the population grows to the point where life is a zero-sum game and you can't live unless somebody else dies. The only way to maintain peace and prosperity on any scale in the long run is to impose reproduction control on individuals by society. That's the only way to solve a tragedy of the commons. It's with social control. It's with laws, rules that people are coerced to obey for the common good. And that's really the only solution. And neither humanism nor ethno-altruism can get us to that solution because both of those views are themselves ideologies that are used to divide people into competing groups for the sake of competition. Right now, it's a kind of cultural, mimetic, political competition. But those ideologies could be used to organize people to fight a war. Right? There's nothing about them that prevents that. Any kind of ideology can provide people with the moral double standard that they need to justify warfare. And that's the role of ideology. That's the function of ideology. It is to give people the moral double standard that they need to justify warfare. When the Easter Islanders went to war with one another over their limited supply of food, I'm sure that they divided along some kind of ideological divide, some kind of quasi-religious divide. And those ideologies were used as gang signs, as signifiers of which group you belong to. I'm pretty sure that's what happened because that's what always happens. That's what human beings do. They use beliefs, certain beliefs, usually religious or quasi-religious beliefs, as group identity signifiers. And this gives them a way of dividing into groups to compete. And when there's no way to win by cooperating on a large scale, people are going to divide into groups to fight. So the key thing to prevent that is to have a system that prevents us from reaching our limits or coming into conflict. to have the rule of law and to use it to limit reproduction. That's the way you create a stable, peaceful, prosperous civilization. And the Easter Islanders could have done that, but they didn't. Instead, they built statues. And we're doing something similar today. We're not solving the fundamental problems that we face. We're exacerbating them constantly. And we're not really looking for solutions. We're looking for things that make us feel good, that plug into our emotions in a certain way, and give us a feeling of self-righteousness and, moral certainty that divide the world into us versus them, good versus evil. And so we're preparing ourselves for a great conflict. We're carrying out this program, this biological and cultural program of group conflict. But that's not going to give us peace and prosperity, right? It might give the winners peace and prosperity for some period of time, but given the way the world works now, given the fact that we have a global civilization and nuclear power plants and nuclear bombs and a global economy that is very interdependent, we really can't afford to be tribal in that way. And I know that's going against what the alt-right believes, but they're wrong. Tribalism is not the answer. Okay, think back to what happened on Easter Island. Imagine you had two groups, humanists and tribalists, or globalists in this case, who would have been islandists, versus, let's call them nationalists or sub-islandists, people who were pro their little sections. Well, when they ran out of food, neither of those attitudes or positions could solve the problem that they had too many people for the food supply. The Easter Islandists, who in this analogy are the humanists, would say we have to all hold hands and sing songs and share everything because we're all equally valuable. And so they would all die. If everybody adopted that belief, then they would all die because there wasn't enough food to feed them all. And if you divided it up, well, then everybody would get too little food to survive. So they would all die. It would be egalitarian in the sense that everyone would get the same outcome. They would all die. Dividing up allowed some to live. And so that might be a good strategy for an individual in that situation, to join a group, a smaller group, and fight. But it didn't maintain their society. It didn't maintain their way of life. And it didn't solve the problem that they were living on a finite island. It might allow some people to win and go on to the next generation. But then they would have to do it all over again. And over and over and over. Forever. Right? They would have to fight forever because war would now be the limiting factor. The thing that limits their population growth. Unless they had some other way of limiting it, like birth control, they would have to limit it with war. And so once they reached the maximum population for the island, then the war solution entails fighting forever. An endless war that just goes on and on and on. And the only function it has is to maintain the population at a level at which people have enough food to live. And once they divided into warring factions, the productivity of the island would go down because they wouldn't be able to cooperate on the scale of the entire island. And they would have to leave buffer zones between the groups because, you don't want to be too close to the people who want to kill you, right? So the overall productivity of the island would go down even more by dividing into groups. But just all working together doesn't make food fall from the sky, right? So neither of those approaches could actually solve the problem that they faced. And remember, Easter Island is a very close analogy to the modern world. We have limited resources, we have a growing population, and we have something close to global peace and prosperity emerging. But it can't last unless we have some way of limiting the population. And I guess that's the fundamental point that I want to make. You know, that both humanism and ethno-altruism, whether it's white nationalism or some other flavor of that, are ideologies that people use to compete and to organize themselves into groups to compete. And they don't give us solutions that lead to peace and prosperity in the long run. Both lead to destruction. Both of them lead us to collapse. So that's the point I want to make here. And also to point out that Easter Island is a counterexample to both the humanist and the ethno-altruist views of human nature. It was a very controlled experiment, a natural experiment in which they were isolated on an island that was initially a paradise of abundant resources, and they were a genetically pure population. And in spite of those facts, within about 500 years, human nature generated a catastrophe on Easter Island. So, that's the point. Human beings aren't nice, and pretending that we are won't change anything, but neither will dividing into little groups and fighting. That's not going to solve anything either. All right, I'll end it there. I'll link to some blog posts related to this that I think do a better job of explaining it, and also of explaining the role of ideology in group conflict. And that's it. Thanks for listening.